The autumn afternoon had settled over St. Mary Mead with that particular golden quality that made even the most ordinary events seem touched by significance. The leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the high street had turned to amber and rust, and they drifted down in lazy spirals to carpet the cobblestones with nature's own confetti. It was precisely the sort of day that made one believe in the essential goodness of English village life, which was exactly why Miss Jane Marple had learned to be most watchful on such occasions. She sat in the passenger seat of Colonel Bantry's motor car, her gloved hands folded neatly over her knitting bag, observing the scene before them with those deceptively mild blue eyes that had witnessed more human folly than most people encountered in several lifetimes. The destination of their afternoon excursion stood before them. The old Curiosity Bookshop, its freshly painted sign swaying gently in the breeze, announcing the village's newest cultural endeavor. Rather exciting, isn't it, Jane? Lady Bantry's voice carried from the back seat, bright with the enthusiasm she brought to all new social ventures. Our very own antiquarian bookshop. Sebastian assures me he has quite remarkable treasures hidden away in those dusty corners. I do hope he's found something interesting about the village history. You know how I adore a good local scandal, particularly if it's old enough to be respectable. Miss Marple smiled gently at her old friend's excitement, though something in Lady Bantry's voice, a slight breathlessness perhaps, or an edge of forced gaiety, caught her attention. Dolly Bantry was not typically one for nervous chatter, yet she had barely paused for breath during the entire journey from Gossington Hall. I'm sure Mr. Linton has curated his collection with great care, Miss Marple replied mildly. Bookshops do tend to accumulate the most fascinating remnants of people's lives. One never knows what secrets might be hiding between the pages of an old ledger or tucked into a family Bible. The bookshop itself occupied a narrow building that had housed various enterprises over the decades, a greengrocer's, a milliner's, and most recently a rather unsuccessful tea shop. Now its large front window displayed an artful arrangement of leather-bound volumes, antique maps, and curious objects that caught the afternoon light. A brass compass, a collection of Victorian mourning jewelry, and prominently featured a small stack of local histories bound in faded red morocco. As they approached the entrance, Miss Marple noted the small crowd that had already gathered. The St. Mary Mead Literary and Antiquarian Society's inaugural autumn book fair and tea had clearly captured the village's imagination, though she suspected the attraction had as much to do with curiosity about the proprietor as with any genuine literary enthusiasm. Sebastian Linton stood just inside the doorway, greeting his guests with the practiced charm of a man accustomed to making favorable first impressions. He was perhaps 45, tall and distinguished, with prematurely silver hair and the sort of cultivated manner that suggested either excellent breeding or careful study of those who possessed it. His smile was warm and engaging, yet Miss Marple detected something watchful in his dark eyes, the look of a man who was always calculating the effect of his words before he spoke them. Lady Bantry, Colonel Bantry, and the famous Miss Marple, he exclaimed as they entered. What an honor to have such distinguished guests grace my humble establishment. I do hope you'll find something of interest among my modest offerings. The interior of the shop had been transformed for the occasion. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, facing a small lectern, while a table laden with tea service and plates of seed cake occupied the space near the back wall. The shelves themselves were a bibliophile's dream. Volumes on local history, collections of poetry, novels both classic and contemporary, and an intriguing section devoted to what the handwritten sign described as personal papers and estate clearances. Miss Marple positioned herself in a chair near the window, from which vantage point she could observe both the assembled guests and the street outside. Her knitting needles began their familiar rhythm as she studied the gathering with the sort of gentle attention that most people mistook for elderly distraction. Mrs. Price Ridley had claimed a prominent seat in the front row, her formidable hat adorned with what appeared to be an entire murdered pheasant. She was interrogating Mr. Linton, about his previous experience in the book trade with the persistence of a magistrate examining a suspicious witness. Near the refreshment table, the vicar's wife, dear Griselda Clement, was attempting to organize the tea service while simultaneously extracting gossip from anyone within earshot. But it was the interactions she observed around the edges of the gathering that caught Miss Marple's particular attention. Young doctor Haydock stood near a shelf of medical texts, but his gaze kept drifting toward Miss Diana Harmon, the village's accomplished pianist, who appeared unusually agitated. She clutched her handbag as though it contained something precious, and her normally composed demeanor showed distinct signs of strain. Even more intriguing was the presence of Mr. Reginald Amos, a quiet man in his 50s who kept the accounts for several local businesses. He had positioned himself in the shadows near the back of the shop, and Miss Marple noticed that his attention was focused not on the books, but entirely on Sebastian Linton. There was something in his pale eyes, a mixture of recognition and what might have been fear, that suggested their acquaintance predated Mr. Linton's arrival in St. Mary Mead. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sebastian Linton called for attention, his voice carrying easily through the small space. "Before we begin our little program, I thought you might be interested to know that I've recently acquired several items of particular local significance. Books and documents that once belonged to families right here in the village." A murmur of interest rippled through the audience. Lady Bantry leaned forward in her chair, her expression suddenly sharp with attention. "In fact," Linton continued with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "I have here something that I believe will be of special interest to one of our most distinguished residents." He moved to a glass display case that Miss Marple hadn't noticed before, partially concealed behind a tall shelf of theological works. From it, he withdrew a slim volume bound in dark green leather, its gilt lettering faded but still legible. "Gossington Hall, Household Accounts, 1922-1925, he read aloud. A fascinating glimpse into the domestic arrangements of one of our finest houses during the years immediately following the Great War. The entries are quite illuminating. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for just a moment as she observed Lady Bantry's reaction. Her friend had gone very still, her face pale beneath her carefully applied rouge. Colonel Bantry, bless him, appeared oblivious to any undercurrent, but Miss Marple had not spent 60 years studying human nature without learning to recognize the signs of genuine distress. "How fascinating," Lady Bantry managed, her voice slightly strained. "I had quite forgotten that old ledger existed. Such tedious domestic details. I'm sure no one would find them remotely interesting." "On the contrary," Sebastian Linton replied smoothly, "I find that domestic details often reveal the most intriguing secrets. The bills one pays, the services one requires, the discretions one finds necessary to purchase. All quite fascinating from a historical perspective, naturally." The silence that followed this observation was thick with tension. Miss Marple noticed that Mr. Ames had moved closer, his face bearing an expression of grim satisfaction. Miss Harmon had gone even paler, if possible, and was now gripping her handbag so tightly that her knuckles showed white through her gloves. It was at that moment that the front door chimed, and a late arrival entered the shop. Arthur Bantry, Lady Bantry's nephew, stood in the doorway like a figure from a particularly dramatic novel. He was a handsome man in his early 30s, but there was something dissolute about his appearance. His clothes were expensive but rumpled. His hair needed cutting, and his eyes held the slightly desperate look of a man who had been living beyond his means for some time. "Uncle Arthur!" Lady Bantry exclaimed, though her voice held more alarm than pleasure. "What a surprise to see you here." "I'm sure it is, Aunt Dolly," Arthur replied, his gaze fixed on Sebastian Linton with unmistakable hostility. "Particularly considering the nature of Mr. Linton's recent acquisitions." The atmosphere in the small shop had become decidedly uncomfortable. Miss Marple observed the tableau with growing interest. Sebastian Linton, standing with the account book still in his hands, his expression carefully neutral. Lady Bantry, struggling to maintain her composure. Arthur Bantry radiating barely controlled anger, and in the background, Mr. Ames watching it all with the satisfaction of a man witnessing the fulfillment of a long-held plan. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife through butter, "we might proceed with the program. I'm sure everyone is eager to hear about the shop's other treasures." Sebastian Linton seized upon the suggestion with obvious relief. "Of course, Miss Marple. How thoughtful of you. Mr. Petherick has prepared a fascinating talk on the history of our village through its printed materials." But even as old Mr. Petherick began his presentation, Miss Marple noticed that the real drama was taking place in the margins. Arthur Bantry had moved to stand near his aunt, and she was whispering urgently in his ear. Mr. Ames continued his watchful vigil from the shadows, and Sebastian Linton, despite his apparent attention to the speaker, kept glancing toward the account book he had placed on the counter, as though it were a talisman of some sort. Miss Marple had witnessed many such scenes over the years, and she recognized the signs. Secrets were about to be exposed, old grievances were stirring to life, and the peaceful atmosphere of the autumn afternoon was about to be shattered by forces that had been building beneath the surface of village life for far too long. She was not, therefore, entirely surprised when the scream came. It pierced the gentle murmur of Mr. Petherick's discourse like a knife, high and sharp and full of genuine terror. Ms. Clement, who had been arranging teacups near the back of the shop, stood frozen with her hand pressed to her mouth, staring at something behind the counter. "Oh," she gasped. "Oh, dear God. Someone, Dr. Haydock, come quickly." The doctor pushed through the suddenly agitated crowd, his medical training overriding social niceties. Miss Marple, moving with the surprising swiftness that sometimes seized her in moments of crisis, followed close behind. Behind the counter, in the narrow space between the shelves and the back wall, lay Mr. Reginald Ames. He was sprawled awkwardly on his side, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling, his face bearing the unmistakable signs of cyanide poisoning, the cherry-red flush of the skin, the rictus of the final convulsion. Near his outflung hand lay a small amber bottle, its cork removed, and in the suddenly still air of the bookshop, Miss Marple detected the unmistakable scent of bitter almonds. "He's dead," Dr. Haydock announced grimly, rising from his examination. "Poisoned by the look of it. Hydrocyanic acid, I'd say. Quick and efficient." Miss Marple stood very still, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The positioning of the body, the location of the bottle, the expressions on the face around her. All of it was being carefully catalogued in that remarkable mind that had solved so many puzzles over the years. Murder at air. Mary Mead once again. And this time it had chosen the most unlikely of venues, a cozy bookshop on a golden autumn afternoon. But Miss Marple was not fooled by the apparent randomness of it all. In her experience, murder was rarely random, and the secrets that drove people to kill were usually hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the patience and wisdom to read the signs correctly. The old bookshop that knew Lady Bantry's secret had claimed its first victim. But Miss Marple suspected it would not be the last. The moments following Dr. Haydock's grim pronouncement stretched with that peculiar quality of suspended time that Miss Marple had observed so often in the wake of sudden death. The assembled guests stood frozen in a tableau of shock and uncertainty, each processing the transformation of their pleasant literary afternoon into something far more sinister. Mrs. Price Ridley was the first to break the silence, her voice rising in indignant bewilderment. "Suicide? In a bookshop? Really, the inconsideration of it all," she declared, her pheasant-adorned hat quivering with moral outrage. Poor Mr. Linton's opening quite ruined, though I suppose one must expect such things when dealing with accountants. Such dreary, secretive men. Sebastian Linton himself appeared less concerned with the social impropriety than with the potential damage to his reputation. His face had gone pale beneath his carefully maintained tan, and his hands trembled slightly as he moved to straighten some displaced books on the counter. Miss Marple noticed that his first instinct was to position himself protectively near the glass display case where the green ledger still lay visible. The arrival of Inspector Slack was announced by the aggressive rumble of a police motor car and the slam of doors that suggested official urgency. He burst through the bookshop entrance with characteristic bluster, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with the sort of quick assessment that often missed more than it caught. "Right then, what's all this?" he demanded, his gaze settling on Dr. Haydock. "Suicide, is it? Poison? Well, that's straightforward enough. These quiet types often brood themselves into desperate acts. We'll have this wrapped up by tea time." Miss Marple, seated quietly in her corner chair with her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm, observed the inspector's hasty conclusion with mild concern. In her experience, the most obvious explanations were often the most dangerous to accept without careful examination. "Inspector," she said gently, her voice carrying just enough to be heard without seeming intrusive, "I wonder if you might examine that teacup on the side table, the one with the blue cornflowers?" Inspector Slack paused in his preliminary examination of the body to glance irritably in her direction. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd turn up. What about the cup?" "Mr. Ames was drinking from it just before the presentation began," she explained with characteristic mildness. "And I couldn't help noticing that distinctive scent of bitter almonds seems to be coming from that direction as well as from the bottle by his hand." The inspector's expression shifted from annoyance to grudging attention. Dr. Haydock moved to examine the cup, bending to smell its contents before nodding grimly. "She's right, Inspector. Definitely hydrocyanic acid in the tea. Stronger concentration than what's left in the bottle, I'd say." This revelation sent a ripple of unease through the assembled guests. The comfortable theory of suicide suddenly seemed far less certain, and with it came the chilling realization that if Mr. Ames hadn't taken his own life, someone in this very room had murdered him. During the confusion that followed this discovery, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a movement that others missed. Lady Bantry had risen unsteadily from her chair, leaning heavily on her nephew's arm as though the shock had overwhelmed her. As they moved toward the door, Arthur Bantry's hand shot out with practiced swiftness, snatching the green ledger from the display case and sliding it smoothly into his coat pocket. The theft was accomplished in seconds, masked by the general distraction of the police activity. Miss Marple's needles never paused in their clicking, but her mind carefully catalogued this significant development. Whatever secrets that household account book contained, they were important enough to steal in the shadow of murder. Inspector Slack began separating the witnesses for individual questioning, his earlier confidence in a simple suicide now replaced by the grim determination of a man facing a proper investigation. Sebastian Linton hovered anxiously near his counter, clearly distressed by the violation of his carefully arranged shop. Lady Bantry appeared on the verge of collapse, while her nephew maintained an expression of studied calm that didn't quite reach his eyes. Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her knitting providing the perfect cover for continued observation. The afternoon had taken a decidedly darker turn, but she found herself oddly unsurprised. In her long experience, secrets had a way of demanding their due, and the old bookshop seemed to be collecting more than its share of both mysteries and those desperate to keep them hidden. The questioning proceeded with Inspector Slack's characteristic blend of efficiency and impatience, conducted in the cramped office behind the bookshop, where the scent of old leather and tragedy seemed to mingle in the stale air. Miss Marple, through the gentle persistence that few could resist, had positioned herself where she could observe the witnesses awaiting their turn, their faces revealing far more than their eventual statements would contain. Lady Bantry emerged from her interview looking distinctly shaken, leaning heavily on Arthur's arm as though the shock had overwhelmed her usually robust constitution. As they moved toward the door, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the swift movement of Arthur's hand to his coat pocket, where the telltale bulge of the stolen ledger was just visible to one trained in noticing such details. "I'm taking Aunt Dolly straight to Gossington," Arthur announced, his voice carrying that studied casualness that often accompanied guilt. "This whole business is Most distressing." "Quite natural," Miss Marple murmured, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm. "Though I noticed you arrived rather late this afternoon, just before poor Mr. Ames was discovered." Arthur's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Train from London was delayed. Anyone at the station can confirm it." "Oh, I'm sure Inspector Slack will verify that," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Delays can be so inconvenient, putting one somewhere at precisely the wrong moment." Their eyes met briefly, and something wary flickered in Arthur's gaze before he guided his aunt away. Miss Marple watched them go, noting how Lady Bantry's trembling had intensified during this exchange. Diana Harmon's interview proved equally illuminating, though not for anything she said. When called to the office, the young pianist rose with visible reluctance, her musician's hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed white. As she passed Miss Marple's chair, she stumbled, her handbag spilling its contents across the floor. Among the usual feminine items rolled a small glass vial, empty, but bearing a chemist's label that Miss Marple couldn't quite read before Miss Harmon snatched it up with a gasp of mortification. "Clumsy of me," the young woman muttered, her face flushing crimson. "Just nerves, you understand." But Miss Marple understood rather more than Miss Harmon would have wished. The vial, combined with the faint yellow staining she had noticed on the girl's fingers, painted a picture that was becoming increasingly clear. Sebastian Linton's distress became more apparent as the afternoon wore on. When he thought no one was watching, he moved to the display case where the household accounts had been exhibited, his face registering genuine shock at discovering the missing ledger. His gaze swept the room, settling briefly on the space where Arthur Bantry had stood. But for reasons of his own, he chose not to raise an alarm about the theft. By evening, when the last witness had been questioned and released, Miss Marple made her way home through streets that hummed with speculation. At the post office, she encountered Mrs. Polk, who had cleaned for Mr. Ames twice weekly for the past decade. "Such a shock, Miss Marple," the woman confided, eager to share her burden. "And him in such spirits yesterday morning, too. He was actually singing while I did the brass. Imagine that. Mr. Ames never sang. He told me he was coming into a bit of luck, said he'd be able to retire to the coast by Christmas." This revelation stopped Miss Marple in her tracks. Men anticipating comfortable retirement did not typically swallow cyanide on autumn afternoons. It suggested instead a man who had successfully negotiated payment for something valuable. Perhaps silence. The final piece of the afternoon's puzzle came when she passed the bookshop itself. Through the window, she could see Sebastian Linton frantically searching through the volumes behind his counter, pulling books from shelves, shaking them out and tossing them aside in growing desperation. He was looking for the green ledger, unaware that Arthur Bantry had already spirited it away. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, her knitting forgotten in her lap as she considered the day's revelations. The pattern was beginning to emerge with the clarity of a photograph developing in solution. Mr. Ames had not died from despair, but from commerce gone wrong, a transaction where the buyer had chosen to pay with poison rather than pounds. The household accounts contained secrets valuable enough to kill for, and somewhere in the web of relationships connecting her neighbors lay the truth about who had decided that murder was preferable to exposure. The old bookshop had indeed known Lady Bantry's secret, but it was becoming clear that it knew several others as well. The morning after the murder brought a peculiar energy to St. Mary Mead, that mixture of horror and excitement that accompanies scandal in small communities. At the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley held court with the authority of an eyewitness, regaling her audience with increasingly embellished details about the poor Mr. Ames's final moments. She had, it seemed, suspected something amiss from the very beginning, though her previous interactions with the accountant had been limited to nodding acknowledgments in the street. Miss Marple, collecting her pension with characteristic punctuality, listened to the theories swirling around her with that air of gentle attention that so many mistook for elderly wool-gathering. The consensus seemed to favor suicide, with various speakers demonstrating surprising familiarity with the properties of cyanide. In a village of prize-winning gardens, she reflected, poison was unfortunately neither exotic nor difficult to obtain. Haydock's arrival at her cottage shortly after breakfast brought more substantial revelations. The post-mortem had confirmed cyanide poisoning, but with a significant detail that Inspector Slack had chosen not to publicize. The small bottle found beside Mr. Ames contained the same poison, but heavily diluted, far too weak to cause death. Someone wanted it to appear as suicide, the doctor explained, accepting tea with the weariness of a man who had worked through the night. The real poison was in the teacup, concentrated enough to kill within minutes, but the bottle was clearly placed there afterward to support the theory of self-destruction. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "Oh, very interesting. And I suppose the tea service revealed nothing about who might have prepared the fatal cup. Anyone could have approached the table during the confusion before Mr. Linton's presentation. The cups were part of a set provided by the shop. Nothing distinctive." He paused, studying her with professional concern. "You're thinking of someone specific, aren't you?" Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Griselda Clement, breathless with indignation. Inspector Slack had spent the morning interviewing Sebastian Linton, and disturbing facts had emerged about the bookseller's background. He had operated similar establishments in 3 different towns over the past 5 years, always arriving suddenly and departing under mysterious circumstances. "Leonard says there's something restless about the man," Griselda confided. "Not typical of someone genuinely devoted to old books and manuscripts. And when pressed about how he acquired the Gossington accounts, he became quite evasive, claimed they came from a solicitor's clearance in Bath, but couldn't provide proper, documentation." The afternoon brought a visit from Lady Bantry, who appeared at Miss Marple's door in a state of considerable distress. Her usual vivacity had been replaced by obvious anxiety, and she clutched her handbag as though it contained her last hope of respectability. "Jane, I must confess something terrible," she began without preamble. "Arthur did take that ledger yesterday. I saw him do it. But there's more. Those household accounts contain details of payments made in 1923, when we had to resolve a most delicate situation involving a young maid and false accusations. The records show exactly how much we paid for her silence." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "And Mr. Ames had discovered this? Yesterday morning, Arthur received a letter from him demanding £500. Ames claimed he knew what really happened in 1923 and who helped us cover it up." Lady Bantry's voice dropped to a whisper. "Arthur came down from London specifically to confront both Ames and Linton. He was furious about the blackmail attempt." The pieces were beginning to form a pattern in Miss Marple's mind, though not the one Inspector Slack was pursuing. That evening, she encountered Dr. Haydock outside the police station, where he had been consulting about the case. His expression was troubled. "They're focusing on Diana Harmon," he said quietly. "Found cyanide-based wasp killer in her potting shed, and Ames had been pressuring her about some small inheritance. But it doesn't fit, Jane. The man was comfortable with his killer. Someone raised a toast to him or signaled him somehow. It was a social interaction, not a confrontation with someone he was blackmailing." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She had been thinking along similar lines, remembering Mr. Ames's expression just before the speeches began. He hadn't been watching Diana Harmon with predatory intent. Instead, his gaze had been fixed on someone in the front row, his face bearing an expression of smug complicity, the look of a man who believed he was about to collect payment for services rendered. The real killer was still free, and quite possibly feeling very secure in their apparent safety. The following morning brought the sort of crisp clarity that often accompanies revelation, and Miss Marple found herself drawn to methodical investigation rather than speculation. Her first destination was the cottage where Mr. Ames had lived his orderly bachelor existence, though she knew Inspector Slack had already conducted his perfunctory search. "Fortunately, Miss," Polk possessed both a spare key and the conviction that dead geraniums were a greater tragedy than police regulations. "Just keeping things tidy for when his sister comes down from Yorkshire," Mrs. Polk explained, though her conspiratorial whisper suggested she understood the true nature of their visit. "Poor Mr. Ames was always so particular about his papers. Seems wrong to leave them scattered about." The cottage reflected its owner's methodical nature, each item precisely placed according to some internal system of importance. While Mrs. Polk fussed over the window boxes, Miss Marple examined the small writing desk with the thoroughness Inspector Slack's men had lacked. In the wastepaper basket, beneath crumpled household bills, lay a torn envelope postmarked 3 days prior. The bold, slanted handwriting was unmistakably Arthur Bantry's, confirming their correspondence extended beyond a single blackmail demand. But it was what she discovered tucked inside a gardening almanac that proved most illuminating. A folded receipt from a printing firm in Market Basing, dated 2 weeks earlier, for business cards in Sebastian Linton's name. Why would Mr. Ames be ordering calling cards for the bookshop proprietor? The implications were staggering. Not blackmail, but partnership in establishing Linton's false credentials. Her next stop was the village library, where the back issues of the County Gazette yielded their own secrets. In the society pages from 1920, she found a photograph from a London charity gala. Though grainy, it clearly showed a younger Sebastian Linton in animated conversation with a man bearing Arthur Bantry's distinctive profile. The connection predated the bookshop by 5 years. Armed with these revelations, Miss Marple made her way to the old curiosity bookshop, where she found Sebastian Linton arranging volumes with hands that betrayed his inner agitation. His greeting carried the desperate warmth of a man grateful for any customer who wasn't there to gawk at murder. "Such a dreadful shadow over my new enterprise," he said, his cultivated manner showing distinct signs of strain. "I had hoped to establish myself respectably here, and now this tragedy." Miss Marple examined a volume of Tennyson with apparent interest. "I understand someone broke into your premises last night. How very disturbing, though I suppose in your line of work certain documents might be considered quite valuable." Linton's composure slipped fractionally. Historical curiosities. Nothing more." Though I confess I was surprised when nothing was actually stolen. The till remained untouched, yet papers were scattered everywhere. Most peculiar. "Indeed." Miss Marple's tone remained conversational. "I was just admiring this receipt I found among Mr. Ames's effects. For business cards bearing your name, ordered a fortnight ago. Such thoughtfulness on his part. Though one wonders why he felt the need to establish your credentials." The blood drained from Linton's face, leaving him suddenly pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. That is, Mr. Ames was merely being helpful. New businesses require proper presentation." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Rather like old friendships requiring proper concealment. I noticed the most interesting photograph in the Gazette archives. You and Arthur Bantry at a London gathering in 1920. Such a small world, finding old acquaintances in unexpected places." Linton's hands tightened on the book's spine until his knuckles showed white. "You're remarkably well-informed, Miss Marple, perhaps too well-informed for your own comfort." The threat, delivered in his cultured tones, hung in the air between them. Miss Marple continued her examination of the poetry collection as though she hadn't heard it, though her mind was rapidly cataloguing the implications of his reaction. "Knowledge can be such a burden," she observed gently. "Poor Mr. Ames discovered that, didn't he? Partnership in deception is so much more complicated than simple blackmail. When one partner becomes greedy or careless, the other must take decisive action." Before Linton could respond, the shop bell announced another visitor. Arthur Bantry entered with none of his previous day's bluster, his face haggard and his clothes bearing signs of a sleepless night. He stopped short when he saw Miss Marple, his expression cycling through surprise, calculation, and what might have been fear. "Still investigating, Miss Marple?" he asked with forced lightness. "I should think the police have matters well in hand." "Perhaps," she replied, rising from her examination of the books. though I find it fascinating how old friendships resurface in the most unexpected circumstances. Mr. Linton was just explaining how Mr. Ames came to order his business cards. Arthur's gaze shot to his confederate, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. The exchange lasted mere seconds, but it confirmed everything Miss Marple had suspected about their partnership in this deadly masquerade. The atmosphere in the bookshop had grown thicker with unspoken accusations and barely concealed desperation. Miss Marple observed the tableau before her with the patient attention of someone who had learned that truth often emerged not from direct confrontation, but from the spaces between words, the glances that lingered too long, and the silences that spoke volumes. Arthur Bantry's attempt at casual defiance was betrayed by the slight tremor in his hands as he lit a cigarette. "I came to discuss certain missing property," he said, his voice carrying the forced steadiness of a man walking a tightrope. "Property that belongs to my family and was obtained through questionable means." Sebastian Linton's cultivated facade showed distinct cracks. "Your family discarded those accounts years ago. They were legally acquired through estate clearances, as I've explained to the authorities." Liar. The word fell like a stone into still water. "Ames told me exactly how you arranged this scheme. He was to obtain the ledger discreetly. You were to display it prominently enough to alarm my aunt, and together you'd negotiate payment for its return in silence. Extortion dressed as antiquarian commerce. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, though her mind was cataloguing each revelation with the precision of a ledger clerk. The bookshop had been nothing more than an elaborate stage set, she realized, designed to lend respectability to what was essentially a sophisticated blackmail operation. The shop bell's chime interrupted the tense exchange, admitting Inspector Slack with characteristic bluster, though his expression carried an unusual satisfaction. "Interesting timing, gentlemen. I've just returned from market basing with some fascinating information about your previous business arrangements." He produced a folded document from his coat. "Trading as Linton and Ames, booksellers and estate clearance agents. Closed suddenly when questions arose about missing items from estate inventories. No charges brought, but the bank clerk remembered both partners quite clearly. The revelation settled over the room like dust from a collapsed building." Miss Marple watched Arthur Bantry's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and what appeared to be genuine fear. This was not a man who had expected his confederate's criminal history to surface so quickly. "Rather ingenious, really," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Establishing yourself as a respectable dealer provided perfect cover for discovering which families had secrets worth protecting. Mr. Ames, with his access to household accounts, could identify vulnerable targets. You would then acquire compromising documents and arrange for their prominent display." Before Linton could respond, the bell chimed again. Diana Harmon entered, her face pale with exhaustion and her hands trembling as she clutched a small envelope. "Inspector, I must give you this. It's a letter from Mr. Ames that I should have shown you yesterday." Inspector Slack examined the letter with growing interest, his eyebrows rising as he read. Well. I have it on excellent authority that your late aunt's bequest was not as straightforward as you believe. If certain dates and signatures were examined closely, unkind conclusions might be drawn. I am prepared to ensure such matters remain hypothetical for a consideration." Diana's composure finally cracked. "He knew I helped my aunt with her accounts when her memory began failing. Sometimes I guided her hand. It was all for her benefit, but on paper—" She shivered, unable to finish. Arthur Bantry had been listening with growing agitation. "Don't you see?" he burst out. "This proves Ames was blackmailing multiple people. I had no reason to kill him. Dead men can't return stolen property or provide information about other copies of those damned accounts." The logic was sound, Miss Marple had to admit. A man hoping to recover compromising documents would hardly murder the only person who could reveal their location, yet something in the pattern of relationships troubled her. A sense that the true motive lay deeper than simple blackmail. "Then, perhaps," she suggested carefully, We should consider who else might have discovered your arrangement and decided to eliminate Mr. Ames before he could expose their secrets. After all, blackmailers who trade in old scandals often accumulate dangerous knowledge about multiple families. Inspector Slack was already reaching for his handcuffs, his earlier satisfaction hardening into certainty. Motive, opportunity, and means. Arthur Bantry had them all. We found evidence of his early arrival in the village, his access to photographic chemicals, and his desperate need to silence Ames. The case is clear enough. Miss Marple's needles clicked with increased tempo as she watched the inspector prepare to make his arrest. The evidence against Arthur was compelling, almost too perfectly arranged. Yet her long experience had taught her to be most suspicious when cases appeared to solve themselves so neatly. Someone had been very clever indeed, using the existing web of blackmail and deception to conceal a more calculated crime. As Inspector Slack moved forward with grim purpose, Miss Marple felt the familiar certainty that justice was about to take a wrong turn, and the real killer would remain free to strike again. The morning after Inspector Slack's confident pronouncements brought an unsettling quiet to St. Mary Mead, the sort of stillness that follows a thunderstorm when everyone waits to assess the damage. Miss Marple sat in her garden with her second cup of tea, ostensibly admiring the late roses but actually reviewing the previous day's revelations with the methodical precision of someone who had learned not to trust obvious conclusions. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Bantry, whose usually robust demeanor showed distinct signs of strain. He declined her offer of refreshment, instead pacing her small parlor with the agitation of a man wrestling with uncomfortable truths. "Jane, I've been thinking about this business all night," he began without preamble. "Arthur may be a wastrel, but he's not a poisoner. That requires a different sort of character entirely. Someone calculating, patient. Arthur's never shown patience for anything in his life." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Poison is indeed the weapon of the planner, Colonel, someone who thinks several moves ahead." "Exactly. And there's something else that troubles me. That ledger everyone's so concerned about. It appeared on the police station steps this morning, wrapped in brown paper with no note. If Arthur stole it to protect Dolly's reputation, why return it anonymously after his arrest?" This development aligned perfectly with Miss Marple's growing suspicions. The return of the ledger suggested someone with no real interest in its contents. Someone who had used it merely as a prop in a larger deception. A truly guilty Arthur would have destroyed such evidence, not delivered it to the authorities. Her thoughts were interrupted by Diana Harmon's arrival, the young pianist appearing at the garden gate with obvious reluctance. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usual composure had been replaced by nervous energy that spoke of sleepless nights. "Miss Marple, I must tell you something about that afternoon," she said, accepting tea with trembling hands. "I've been replaying every moment, and there's a detail that doesn't fit." Mr. Ames was drinking from his cup well before Arthur arrived. "I remember because Mrs. Clement commented on having to prepare an additional setting when he appeared late." The timeline issue had been troubling Miss Marple as well. If the poison was administered through the tea, Arthur's late arrival made him an unlikely candidate. More significantly, she recalled Mr. Ames's demeanor just before his collapse. Not the wariness of a man facing his blackmail victim, but the satisfaction of someone who believed his business was proceeding exactly as planned. Dr. Haydock's arrival provided medical confirmation of these suspicions. His review of the post-mortem findings revealed that the poison concentration suggested ingestion at least 10 minutes before collapse. Impossible if Arthur had been the agent. "Inspector Slack is pursuing the wrong man," Haydock declared flatly. "The medical evidence simply doesn't support his theory. But he's convinced Arthur somehow prepared the poison earlier. It's nonsense. The man had no access to the bookshop before the event." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the identity of the true killer remained tantalizingly elusive. Someone had used the existing web of blackmail and suspicion as perfect camouflage, allowing an innocent man to be arrested while they remained safely hidden. "I wonder," she mused aloud, if we've been approaching this from entirely the wrong angle? What if Mr. Ames wasn't killed to prevent exposure of his blackmail scheme, but because he had discovered something about his partner that made him too dangerous to live? Diana's eyes widened with understanding. You mean Sebastian Linton killed him? But they were working together, were they? Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle clicking. Or had Mr. Ames perhaps learned something about Mr. Linton's past that made their partnership uncomfortable? The question hung in the afternoon air like incense, heavy with implication. Colonel Bantry leaned forward, his military instincts engaged by the possibility of tactical deception. You're suggesting Linton used the blackmail scheme as cover for eliminating a threat? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple replied carefully, that we may have been observing a performance designed to misdirect our attention. The blackmail, the obvious suspects, even Arthur's unfortunate behavior, all of it could have been orchestrated to conceal a much simpler motive. Before anyone could respond, Mrs. Polk appeared at the garden gate, her face flushed with excitement and alarm. Miss Marple, I thought you should know. I went back to Mr. Ames's cottage this morning, and someone's been there again. Not searching this time, but cleaning. Scrubbed the kitchen spotless, they did, and removed every trace of those chemical smells. The implications were staggering. Someone was systematically eliminating evidence, confident enough in their safety to return to the scene and remove the last traces of their crime. This was not the behavior of a panicked amateur, but of someone who understood exactly what needed to be hidden and possessed the nerve to accomplish it. Miss Marple rose from her chair with sudden decision. The killer had made one crucial error in their confidence. They had assumed that with Arthur's arrest, the investigation would cease. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most helpful, most concerned, most eager to see justice done. Tomorrow, she would need to set a very careful trap indeed. Miss Marple spent the early morning hours in methodical preparation, her mind working with the precision of a clockmaker assembling delicate mechanisms. The pattern had become clear during her sleepless night. Not the obvious blackmail scheme that had captured everyone's attention, but something far more calculated and deadly. She made her way to Dr. Haydock's surgery as the village was awakening, carrying with her the certainty that comes from seeing all the pieces finally align. "Doctor," she began without preamble, "I've been considering the specific nature of the poison." Hydrocyanic acid has many legitimate uses beyond photography and gardening, does it not? Book restoration, for instance? Doctor, or? Haydock paused in organizing his medical bag, his expression sharpening with interest. Indeed, diluted forms are used to treat mold and insect infestations in old manuscripts. But handling it requires considerable expertise and proper licensing, not something an amateur would attempt. The connection settled into place with satisfying precision. Sebastian Linton had spoken eloquently about restoration work, about saving precious volumes from decay. It provided perfect cover for obtaining dangerous chemicals without arousing suspicion, and explained the faint chemical traces Mrs. Polk had detected in Mr. M's cottage, traces that had required professional-level cleaning to remove. Her next destination was the old curiosity bookshop, where she discovered confirmation of her suspicions. Through the window, despite the closed sign, she could see Linton working frantically among open crates, packing his most valuable stock with the urgency of a man preparing for sudden departure. The scene spoke eloquently of guilt and desperation. When she tapped on the glass, his expression cycled through annoyance, recognition, and finally a guarded wariness that confirmed her worst fears about his true nature. "I'm afraid I'm not open today, Miss Marple," he said, reluctantly admitting her. "Recent events have made it necessary to reorganize." Miss Marple stepped inside, her keen senses immediately detecting the faint but unmistakable scent of bitter almonds lingering in the air. "How thorough of you. Though I noticed the smell of restoration chemicals. Cyanide compounds, unless I'm mistaken." Linton's carefully maintained composure showed its first crack. "Standard preservation procedures, nothing unusual." Of course not, just as there was nothing unusual about the thorough cleaning of Mr. Ames's cottage kitchen. Such dedicated partnership, ensuring no chemical traces remained to embarrass your friend's memory. Her voice carried the gentle certainty that had unnerved more than one criminal in her long acquaintance with human nature. The mask slipped entirely then, revealing the cold calculation beneath the cultivated exterior. You're a meddlesome old woman who should mind her own affairs. Perhaps, but I suspect Mr. Ames said something similar when he discovered your true identity. Not Sebastian Linton, respectable antiquarian, but someone with a history of convenient disappearances when questions arise about missing estate items or suspicious deaths. Miss Marple continued her examination of the packed crates, noting how systematically he had selected items for transport. He tried to extract himself from your partnership, didn't he? Threatened to expose you unless you are sick. Yusubu bought his silence. Linton moved closer, his hand drifting toward a heavy brass paperweight, his eyes holding the predatory focus of a man calculating violence. Arthur Bantry is in custody. The case is closed. Your theories are dangerous to yourself. Not as dangerous as Maraba as a partner who knows too much about your previous ventures. Mr. Ames died because he realized you were planning to abandon him with the blame while you disappeared with the profits. Miss Marple faced him calmly, though she was acutely aware of his proximity and the weapon within his reach. Before he could act on his obvious intentions, the shop bell chimed with perfect timing. Colonel Bantry and Dr. Haydock entered, their presence immediately transforming the atmosphere from menacing to merely tense. Just passing by, the colonel announced cheerfully, though his military eye quickly assessed the situation. Thought you might need assistance with whatever this is? Linton retreated immediately, the mask of civility sliding back into place with practiced ease. But Miss Marple had seen enough. The killer was preparing to run, taking with him not just stolen goods, but the evidence of his crimes. Tonight, Sebastian Linton would attempt to disappear as he had before, leaving St. Mary Mead to mourn its dead and wonder about justice denied. But this time, Miss Marple intended to ensure that justice would not be cheated. Miss Marple's plan required the delicate precision of a master chess player. Each move calculated to exploit the fundamental weakness she had observed in Sebastian Linton's character. His inability to resist demonstrating his superiority when he believed himself unobserved. The trap she conceived would use this arrogance against him, creating circumstances where his true nature would inevitably surface. That evening, she assembled her carefully chosen participants in Dr. Haydock's surgery, where the medical setting provided both privacy and the reassuring presence of someone trained to handle emergencies. Diana Harmon sat pale but resolute, having agreed to play the crucial role after Miss Marple explained how her genuine distress would make the deception convincing. You must remember, my dear, Miss Marple instructed gently, you are not acting a part. You are simply being honest about your fears and intentions. Tell Mr. Linton that you can no longer bear the weight of your secret, that you intend to confess everything to Inspector Slack tomorrow morning. Emphasize that you have all of Mr. Ames's correspondence and mean to show it to the authorities. Inspector Slack, grudgingly convinced by the medical evidence and the discovery of chemical purchase receipts in Linton's name, reviewed the plan with military precision. The shop has a back exit, but Constable Davis will be positioned there. Dr. Haydock and I will be across the street, close enough to intervene, but far enough to avoid suspicion. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Mr. Linton must believe he is dealing with a frightened young woman seeking comfort from the village's respected bookseller. He will see an opportunity to eliminate the last witness to his crimes, and his confidence will make him careless. As darkness settled over Mary Mead, the participants took their positions with the quiet efficiency of a well-rehearsed performance. The old curiosity bookshop glowed warmly in the autumn evening, its windows casting rectangles of golden light onto the damp cobblestones. Through the glass, they could see Linton moving about his shop, arranging books with the nervous energy of a man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Diana approached the shop door with visible reluctance, her shoulders hunched against both the evening chill and her own fears. When Linton admitted her, his greeting carried the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to manipulating others through apparent kindness. From her position behind the churchyard wall, Miss Marple watched the tableau unfold with the keen attention of someone who had spent decades studying human nature at its most revealing moments. Through the uncurtained window, she could observe Linton's body language as Diana spoke, noting how his initial concern gradually transformed into something more calculating. The conversation proceeded exactly as Miss Marple had predicted. Diana's genuine distress made her performance utterly convincing as she explained her intention to confess everything to the authorities. Linton listened with apparent sympathy, occasionally patting her shoulder in a gesture of comfort that Miss Marple recognized as the practiced manipulation of a predator. Then came the crucial moment. Linton moved to the small table where he kept his tea service, ostensibly to offer Diana refreshment to calm her nerves. Miss Marple watched intently as he prepared 2 cups, his movements casual and reassuring. But she noticed what Diana could not see from her position. The swift, practiced motion as Linton's hand dipped below the counter, emerging with something that glinted briefly in the lamplight before disappearing over the rim of one specific cup. The same technique he had used to murder Mr. Ames, employing the restoration chemicals he kept legitimately for his work. The concentrated cyanide solution would act within minutes, and Diana's death would appear to be another tragic suicide, a young woman driven to desperation by guilt over her aunt's affairs. Miss Marple rose from her concealment with quiet purpose. The trap had worked perfectly, revealing not only Linton's method, but his complete willingness to commit murder when threatened with exposure. As she signaled to Inspector Slack, she felt the familiar satisfaction that came from seeing justice about to be served. The net was closing around Sebastian Linton, and tomorrow would bring the final confrontation where all his carefully constructed lies would crumble beneath the weight of truth. But tonight, they had the evidence they needed to ensure... innocent lives would be lost to his deadly ambition. The signal brought Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock through the bookshop door with practiced urgency, their entrance perfectly timed as Sebastian Linton extended the poisoned teacup toward Diana's trembling hands. His expression transformed from solicitous concern to trapped fury in a single heartbeat, the mask of respectability finally slipping to reveal the predator beneath. "I wouldn't drink that if I were you, Miss Harmon," Dr. Haydock said quietly, stepping forward to intercept the cup. "Not unless you fancy joining Mr. Ames in the churchyard." Miss Marple entered with characteristic composure, her knitting bag tucked under her arm as though she were making a social call rather than exposing a murderer. "How thoughtful of you to prepare refreshments, Mr. Linton. Though I suspect this particular blend contains rather more than tea leaves." Linton's carefully constructed facade crumbled like ancient parchment. He backed against the bookshelves, his eyes darting toward the rear exit where Constable Davis waited with grim patience. "You have no proof. I was merely offering comfort to a distressed young woman." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied gently, settling into a nearby chair with the air of someone preparing for a lengthy explanation. "We have considerable proof, beginning with your choice of method. You see, poison is the weapon of the planner, someone who thinks several moves ahead, Mr. Ames wasn't killed in a moment of passion. He was eliminated as part of a carefully calculated strategy." Inspector Slack produced a small envelope from his coat. "Dr. Haydock tested the tea you just prepared. Same concentration of hydrocyanic acid that killed Ames, sourced from your restoration chemicals. Rather damning evidence, wouldn't you say?" The revelation seemed to drain the last of Linton's resistance. His shoulders sagged as he recognized the futility of further deception. "Ames was a fool," he muttered, his cultured accent slipping to reveal something coarser beneath. "He thought we were equal partners, but he was always just a tool." Miss Marple nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose theories had been confirmed. "Precisely." You needed his access to household accounts and his reputation for respectability. He needed your daring and social connections. Together, you identified families with embarrassing secrets worth protecting. The bookshop was merely an elegant stage for your blackmail operations. She paused, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. But, Mr. Ames discovered something about your past, didn't he? Perhaps your real identity. Stephen Lytton, wanted in connection with suspicious deaths in Hampshire and Dorset. When he demanded a larger share of the profits to buy his silence, you realized he had transformed from asset to liability. Linton's laugh held no humor. He got greedy, started making demands, threatening exposure. I couldn't allow that. So you poisoned his tea during the confusion before your presentation, Miss Marple continued. Everyone assumed Arthur Bantry had opportunity because of his dramatic late arrival, but you had already administered the fatal dose by then. Poor Mr. Ames was dying even as Arthur entered the shop. Dr. Haydock stepped forward with professional authority. The timeline matches perfectly. The poison concentration suggests ingestion at least 10 minutes before collapse. Impossible if Arthur had been responsible. Inspector Slack secured the handcuffs with grim satisfaction. Stephen Lytton, you are under arrest for the murder of Reginald Ames and the attempted murder of Miss Diana Harmon. We found your travel arrangements, tickets to France under yet another false name, scheduled for tomorrow morning. As they prepared to lead him away, Linton's composure reasserted itself one final time. You're quite clever, Miss Marple. I underestimated you completely. Assumed you were just another interfering village spinster. That was my fundamental error. Not your only one, she replied quietly. Your real mistake was believing that intelligence made you superior to those you manipulated. But human nature remains constant across all social classes, and cruelty always reveals itself to those patient enough to observe. The bookshop fell silent after their departure, the carefully arranged volumes now seeming like props in a concluded performance. Diana wept softly with relief, while Colonel Bantry made arrangements for her safe transport home. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, preparing to leave the scene of so much deception. Tomorrow would bring Arthur's release, Lady Bantry's relief, and the village's inevitable speculation about how close they had come to condemning an innocent man. But tonight, justice had been served through patience, observation, and the understanding that the most dangerous criminals were often those who believed themselves too clever to, be caught. The old bookshop that knew Lady Bantry's secret had finally yielded its own dark truth. The morning after Sebastian Linton's arrest brought that peculiar quality of light that follows a storm, and Miss Marple sat in her garden receiving visitors with the gracious composure of someone who had merely assisted with a minor domestic inconvenience, rather than prevented murder and freed an innocent man. The autumn roses bloomed with renewed vigor, as though even they sensed the lifting of shadows from St. Mary Mead. Arthur Bantry arrived first, his usual arrogance replaced by genuine humility that transformed his entire bearing. He settled into the garden chair with obvious discomfort, unaccustomed to expressing sincere gratitude. Miss Marple, I owe you my life, he began, his voice stripped of its customary bravado. Inspector Slack told me everything. How you recognized Linton's pattern, how you saved Diana from the same fate as poor Ames. I behaved abominably throughout this affair, thinking myself so clever with our blackmail scheme. Miss Marple's needles maintained their steady rhythm as she studied him with those deceptively mild eyes. You are fortunate that your partner chose to eliminate Mr. Ames rather than you, Arthur. I suspect you would have been his next victim once you had served your purpose. The observation visibly shook him. Lady Bantry's arrival interrupted their conversation, her usual vivacity restored now that the threat of exposure had passed. She embraced her nephew with maternal affection before turning to Miss Marple with tears of genuine gratitude. Jane, you've saved not just Arthur's life, but our family's reputation. Though I confess I've learned a valuable lesson about keeping secrets. If I'd simply acknowledged the truth about that situation in 1923, none of this would have happened. Miss Marple set down her knitting to pour fresh tea. Secrets accumulate interest, like unpaid debts, my dear Dolly. The longer we hide them, the more power they acquire. Mr. Linton understood that principle and exploited it ruthlessly. Dr. Haydock joined them shortly afterward, bringing disturbing news from the police station. Linton confessed everything this morning, hoping for leniency through cooperation. He's connected to at least 3 other suspicious deaths in different counties, elderly victims whose estates he was clearing. The man's a complete psychopath, showed no remorse whatsoever. Diana Harmon arrived last, her composure fully restored after her terrifying ordeal. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper, which she presented to Miss Marple with shy gratitude. A first edition of Tennyson's poems from a reputable dealer in market basing. I wanted you to have something beautiful from a bookshop that wasn't tainted by murder. Her voice trembled slightly. You saved my life. If you hadn't suspected his true nature. Miss Marple accepted the gift with genuine pleasure, though her expression remained characteristically modest. My dear, I merely observed what was there to be seen. Mr. Linton's mistake was assuming that elderly village spinsters were too foolish to recognize evil when it presented itself with cultured manners. As the afternoon progressed, Inspector Slack made an unexpected appearance, his manner grudging but respectful. Your observations were instrumental in solving this case, Miss Marple, though I still don't understand how you knew with such certainty that he would attempt to poison Miss Harmon. Miss Marple smiled gently. It was the pattern, Inspector. Criminals are creatures of habit. Success breeds confidence, and confidence breeds repetition. When Mr. Ames became inconvenient, Linton eliminated him. When he believed Diana held evidence against him, his instinct was to repeat the method. I also noticed he had packed his valuable books, but kept the restoration chemicals easily accessible. A man planning purely to flee would have abandoned everything. The explanation settled over them with the quiet logic that always accompanied Miss Marple's solutions. As her visitors departed, she remained in her garden, watching shadows lengthen across the grass. The mystery had been solved, justice served, and innocence vindicated. Yet she felt the familiar melancholy that accompanied such resolutions, another demonstration that evil could flourish anywhere, wearing masks of respectability and preying on human weakness. The old bookshop would likely remain empty now, its brief existence as a stage for blackmail and murder, ensuring no respectable proprietor would occupy its tainted premises. But life inside Merry Mead would continue with its eternal cycle of small dramas and larger tragedies, playing out against the unchanging backdrop of human nature in all its complexity. Miss Marple picked up her pruning shears, attending to her roses with gentle precision. There was always work to be done in a garden, just as there was always work for someone who understood the darker corners of the human heart. 3 weeks had passed since Sebastian Linton's arrest, and St. Mary Mead had begun that remarkable process of absorption that allows small communities to digest even the most shocking events and return to their essential rhythms. The old Curiosity Bookshop stood empty, its windows dark and doors sealed, though Miss Marple noticed how pedestrians still crossed to the opposite pavement rather than walk. Directly past its threshold, as though murder left invisible stains that respectable people instinctively avoided. The trial had concluded with satisfying swiftness. Linton, whose true identity had been revealed as Stephen Linton, received the death sentence for Reginald Ames's murder and the attempted poisoning of Diana Harmon. Additional charges were pending in Hampshire and Dorset, where investigators had exhumed bodies and discovered traces of the same methodical approach. The newspapers had described Miss Marple as the village detective whose keen observations brought a dangerous predator to justice, causing her considerable embarrassment at the post office. Lady Bantry had weathered the scandal with characteristic resilience. The dreaded household accounts from 1923, once so threatening, had proven anticlimactic when examined. Merely payments to a dismissed maid who had been wrongly accused of theft, compensation generously given though not legally required. The revelation enhanced rather than damaged the Bantry reputation, demonstrating compassion rather than concealing guilt. Arthur Bantry had departed for London with promises of reform that Miss Marple suspected would endure approximately as long as his current contrition. However, she had observed a genuine change in his relationship with Lady Bantry, a newfound respect born from recognizing how narrowly he had escaped the gallows through his reckless schemes. Diana Harmon had emerged from her ordeal with unexpected strength, accepting a teaching position at a girls' school near Bath. Her confession about guiding her aunt's failing hand during document signing had been received with understanding rather than censure. Dr. Haydock had been particularly attentive during her recovery, and Miss Marple had noticed the sort of meaningful glances that suggested romance might bloom from tragedy's ashes. On this particular afternoon, Miss Marple made her way past the abandoned bookshop, her attention caught by something glinting in the dusty window. With permission from the landlord, she entered the musty interior one final time, discovering a calling card that had escaped the police searches. On its reverse, in Reginald Ames's careful script, were the words, "He knows about Dorset Insurance." The significance was immediately clear. Ayres had been documenting his partner's secrets as insurance against betrayal, a precaution that had ultimately proved insufficient. Miss Marple pocketed the card for Inspector Slack, knowing it would provide crucial evidence for the pending charges. That evening, as she sat with her knitting in the familiar comfort of her parlor, Miss Marple reflected on the case's resolution. Her nephew Raymond, visiting from London, had expressed amazement at the calculated evil that had operated beneath such respectable appearances. "Evil rarely announces itself with obvious signs, Raymond," she had explained gently. "It wears masks of respectability, speaks with educated accents, and exploits our tendency to judge character by surface appearances rather than observing actual behavior. Mr. Zeta, Linton understood perfectly that people trust what appears cultured and refined." The mystery had taught St. Mary Mead valuable lessons about the dangers lurking beneath civilized surfaces, though Miss Marple suspected the village would forget quickly, as communities always did, preferring comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths. She picked up her knitting once more, the familiar rhythm soothing after weeks of tension and revelation. Outside, the village settled into its evening routines. The milk boy whistling as he completed his rounds, Mrs. Polk hurrying home with her shopping, the vicar closing the church after evensong. Life continued its eternal patterns, and somewhere within those patterns, new secrets were undoubtedly forming, new resentments taking root, new puzzles waiting to be solved. Bookshop, new Lady Bantry's secret had finally yielded all its mysteries. But Miss Marple knew that human nature remained constant in its capacity for both nobility and depravity, and she would be there, watching gently and noticing everything when the next puzzle presented itself to her patient observation. The roses nodded in the evening breeze, and Miss Jane Marple smiled, content in the knowledge that justice had been served and truth had triumphed once again.